Hello and welcome to Cinphomaniac Rapid Fire, the new sub-series to cover new releases in 10 minutes or less. As we move into November and December, there's so many new releases, 2 or 3 per week, and we want to make sure we can cover them and cover them as close to release as possible, which only makes sense to do it short and spoiler-free. We will make some exception where noted on the spoiler-free stuff, but only after you're being extensively warned. For the most part, expect it to be spoiler-free for most of it, if not all. Last Night in Soho, the new film directed by Edgar Wright. I'd like to start just kind of talking about my anticipation for this movie. It's been an interesting journey because, I'm a fan of Edgar Wright, big fan of the Scott Pilgrim movie, big fan of the Cornetto trilogy. Less a fan of Baby Driver, but it's a good movie for what it's worth. Some problematic actors and being involved aside. But what really got me interested in this film was when Edgar Wright first was talking about doing it, and he was referencing films like Don't Look Now, more supernatural-ish thriller type films. And the first teaser that the film dropped was really cool with using the, red and blue lights flashing and Anya Taylor-Joy's big eyes. And it just felt like, because of that, very, giallo inspired, I don't know if I'm saying that word right, but the Italian genre of like mystery thrillers that, people have noted tend to focus on eyes, like the sort of, Irvin Kershner American film, The Eyes of Laura Mars, right? But then my anticipation kind of waned when the movie dropped a second trailer that honestly I thought was a terrible trailer. I think it even more now having seen the film, but this second trailer really had me worried because it was doing this annoying thing of overly giving away the plot, like things that were clearly second and third act, and that ended up being correct. Plot points are being given in the movie. Like most of the first act of the movie is not in the trailer, weirdly. It's like, I don't know what they were thinking there. And it's not only is it misleading and still a little too spoilery now, having seen the film, the misleading part's the really interesting thing. And this is what I was catching because the first teaser and everything I'd heard about it made me think this is a horror film or at least like a supernatural or spooky thriller. And the trailer made it seem more like it's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but with like a slightly sort of otherworldly twist. And that's it. Like it's just like a fun romp through 60s Hollywood and, there might have been a murder. That's it. It did not feel like a horror film at all. And why you would not want to market a film that I assure you is movie horror, true to the genre through and through, is a pure horror film really. Why you wouldn't want to market that as a horror film, I have no idea when horror remains one of the most popular and box office viable genres. So let's get into what I mean about it being truly horror. Well, for starters, it features jump scares, like quite a few actually, in the as more as it goes on, and they are legit freaky jump scares. Jump scares I'm not the biggest fan of necessarily, but I can appreciate a good one in a good movie. There's also quite a bit of gore, quite a bit of blood. There's even monsters of a kind in the film. So there you go. You got blood, gore, monsters. And the overall sort of sense of style is very inspired by, horror genres, especially, 70s horror, 60s horror, Italian horror. It's got that really stylish sensibility, the way they'll show a knife, etc. And then it's an intense tone. Like the film, once it ramps up into the stakes, it really keeps the volume cranked all the way up for the rest of the film and gets only intense, more intense, and rarely lets up. So it's a really intense ride, like any good horror or intense thriller should be. And then one of the most honestly horror staple things about it is that the fact that the protagonist really stretches your fucking patience. I mean, really. Which gets me to that protagonist, played by Thomasin McKenzie. Now, I'll be honest, not a big fan of her as an actor. I mean, she hasn't been around very long. She's obviously a very young person. I'm sure she's lovely in real life, and, so all due respect to her. But, seeing her in films like Jojo Rabbit, I don't know, it just didn't really do much for me. And so I was feeling, okay, I'm watching the movie, especially the first 15-ish minutes. I'm kind of like, I don't know, is this person just going to kind of turn me off to the whole thing? I hope not. But I gotta say, the more the film went on, the strength of her performance really did win me over. I mean, she's quite good in this movie. Just like really, like, again, like I said, the protagonist is going to stretch your patience, but she manages to hold it together and make it feel believable, the fear and paranoia and hysteria and haunting that she's experiencing. It's quite a good turn from her. So I can't say it's totally turned me into a fan of Thomasin, but, I'll be more optimistic when I see her in things in the future. Let me put it that way. The other co-star on all the posters is, of course, Anya Taylor-Joy, who I'm a big, big fan of. I remain a big fan of her, but I'll just say, it's arguable she didn't really have much to do in this film. I mean, I guess she gets to show her singing chops, gets to look like herself, It's for obvious and good reason. It's not like the film could have sustained that much more, I don't think. But it's interesting. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I do think maybe they could have done a little bit more with her character to give her performance more meat on the bone. But all that being said, the film is really quite great. It's not Edgar Wright's best, in my opinion, but it's a really great genre film in a way that only Edgar Wright can make it. And I think that's a very strong statement. I mean, this feels like an Edgar Wright movie through and through, different than a lot of his other movies, but still him, with the way it's editing, the way it's paced, just the intensity, the shot design, shooting on film, etc. And of course, the soundtrack. I mean, that's kind of maybe Edgar Wright's biggest staple at this point is his highly curated playlist soundtracks, which is something I'm a fan of, something I, hope to aspire to. And yeah, it's, I don't even want to really try to reiterate all the songs. I've only seen the film once, but it's great, obviously. Now, before I get off here, I just want to get into a little bit of light spoilers. And when I say light spoilers, I mean literally nothing that's not in the trailer. The second trailer, but like I said, I think the second trailer gives way too much. This film, interesting enough for our main podcast this week, which we're covering continuing Lynchtober into November. We're covering Mulholland Drive. This film has an interesting sort of set of connections, I feel like, to Mulholland Drive thematically and even visually. One, Mulholland Drive is probably one of the scariest jump scares ever. Two, it is about women who are kind of merging identities or switching places, and there's that aspect of dream versus reality, and then waking up from a dream but only to find yourself in a deeper nightmare. All those things are direct parallels to Mulholland Drive, so it'd be interesting to think if Edgar Wright had referenced that as an influence. There's also a brunette that becomes blonde. You see what I'm saying. Spoilers over. Last thing I want to talk about before we go, because it's really cool, is the fact that I saw this film at the New Beverly Cinema in Los Angeles, in 35mm, the only way to see it in 35mm in LA or maybe anywhere. And I can't imagine seeing it any other way. This is Quentin Tarantino's theater that he curates and manages. And, Edgar Wright and he are best bros, so of course they would do this. And Edgar Wright put in the work of putting together one of the classic New Beverly pre-shows where they take actual film reels of old trailers and things and put it together. So some highlights from that. There was this Soho kind of meter-made newsreel that was a few minutes, and it was a real newsreel from what I can tell, but very funny to watch because of just some awkward choices in the performance and directing. So yeah, that was cool. Then they showed Modesty Blaze, which is a film directed by Joseph Losey and features Dirk Bogarde. So this is something I mentioned very briefly when we talked about this. We did our episode on The Servant, but I didn't go much into it. That's because it felt like an outlier in their output, not something written by Harold Pinter, not some intense cerebral film. In fact, this movie is a very camp, over-the-top 60s kind of movie. It stars Monica Vitti, famous from the Antonioni films like Aventura and La Notte. Also, Terence Stamp is in it, who's, of course, in Last Night in Soho. Then you have another camp classic, seemingly, which I'd never heard of or seen, called Smashing Time. And it's just full-blown 60s mega camp. Michael York's in it, which brings me to the conclusion that it's another film that probably was a big influence on Michael Myers when he was creating Austin Powers. Speaking of another obvious influence on Austin Powers, obviously Austin Powers is meant to be a spoof of James Bond, but after seeing this trailer, I have to think it's most a spoof of this very singular James Bond movie, which is On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is the one Bond film that starred George Lazenby in the role. And the way the trailer is, I've seen the film, but the trailer's on a whole different level. The trailer is so explicitly sexual. With all these gags with the touching and the whatnot. And lastly, that trailer, of course, stars Dame Diana Rigg, or the film includes Dame Diana Rigg, who was in this film. She passed away after the film finished shooting last night in Soho, and so Edgar Wright dedicated it to her. So yeah, very cool. I do recommend everyone see Last Night in Soho if you're an Edgar Wright fan, if you're a horror fan. Yeah, and keep tuned for more Cinphomaniac Rapid Fire. Damn it, we were over 10 minutes.